The long gallery at Thornley Court had been sealed for 11 years, and on the first cold morning of October, Charlotte Vane was the one sent to unseal it. She carried the great iron key in a hand that would not quite hold steady, and she told herself the tremor was only the chill. The steward had given her the key without meeting her eyes. A housemaid did not open rooms. The master's uncle had ordered shut. Yet the uncle had gone to Bath for the waters, and the new young lord had come home to a house that no longer knew him, and someone had to air the north wing before the frost set in. So it fell to her, the lowest woman in the household, walking the coldest corridor, toward the one door no one at Thornley was permitted to name. The key turned with a sound like a bone giving way. Charlotte pushed, and the door resisted, swollen in its frame, and then it swung inward on a darkness that smelled of dust and old varnish and something faintly, terribly sweet. She lifted her candle. The gallery ran the whole length of the wing, and along its walls hung the painted faces of the family that had owned this valley for 200 years. Every one of them turned to the wall. Someone had reversed each frame so that the canvases faced the plaster, and only the blind backs looked out. Someone had wanted these people forgotten. And at the far end, where a tall window should have let in the gray morning, boards had been nailed across the glass. Charlotte stood very still. She had the sudden, unaccountable sense that she was not alone in the room. If a house could hold its breath, Thornley held its. That morning, and so did she. You may think you know already what she found in that gallery. Stay with her a moment longer, because the truth was stranger and quieter than any of them had allowed themselves to imagine. She was 26 years old, and she had been in service since she was 15. Her father had been a country curate with more books than income, and when he died the books were sold, and Charlotte was sent to work. And that was the whole of her story as the world had written it. To the household at Thornley, she was simply the north wing maid, the quiet one, the one who read too well for her station and was therefore not quite to be trusted. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, had said as much to the cook within Charlotte's hearing on her very first week. A girl who reads letters she was never taught to read gives herself airs, Mrs. Pell had said. And airs in a servant are the beginning of trouble. Charlotte had learned to keep her eyes down and her opinions lower. She had learned that being unseen was, in its way, a kind of safety. She had a way of moving through a room that left no mark on it. A stillness she had cultivated the way another woman might cultivate an accomplishment, and it had kept her employed through 3 households and 2 hard winters. She owned 2 gowns, both gray, both turned and returned, until the seams had a history of their own. She owned her father's small Latin Testament, which she had hidden from every housekeeper who might have sold it, and she read it by the last of the candle when the other maids were asleep, moving her lips over the words that had been the whole furniture of her childhood. That was the sum of Charlotte Vane as the ledger of the world recorded her. A gray woman with a dead man's book. It was not, she would have told you, a life to be pitied, because she had long ago stopped measuring it against the lives that might have been. She had made her peace with the smallness. What she had not made her peace with, though she did not yet know it that October morning, was the sight of another person, made smaller, still, made nothing, made a rumor, in a boarded room. She had never, however, learned to stop noticing things, and in that sealed gallery, with the candle throwing her shadow long across the boards, she noticed that the dust on the floor was not even. A path had been worn in it, faint but unmistakable, leading from the door to a curtained alcove at the gallery's northern end. Someone had walked this room, recently. She should have turned around. A wiser servant would have locked the door again, and reported the wing aired, and never spoken of the path in the dust. Instead, Charlotte crossed the gallery, her heart loud in her throat, and drew back the curtain, and found a narrow bed, a washstand, a shelf of books, and a young man sitting upright against the far wall, with his knees drawn up and his eyes fixed on her candle, as though it were the first light he had seen in a very long time. He did not cry out. That was the thing she would remember afterward. The strangeness of his silence. He only looked at her, and then he looked at the open door behind her, and something moved across his face that she had no name for, though she would come to understand it later as the particular caution of a man who has learned that hope is more dangerous than despair. He was perhaps 30, thin in the way of long confinement, with dark hair grown past his collar and a pale, clever, exhausted face. When he spoke, his voice was rough with disuse. "You are new," he said. "I would have remembered you." Charlotte's first thought, absurd and immediate, was that she ought to curtsy, and she did, and the candles shook and threw wild shadows up the reversed portraits. Her second thought was that this room was a prison, and this man was its prisoner, and she had walked into the middle of something no housemaid was meant to survive. Knowing, she asked him who he was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her his name was Edmund, and that he had once been the Earl of Thornley, and that his uncle had told the world he was dead. She did not believe him at first. Of course she did not. The Earl of Thornley was the young man who had arrived a fortnight ago in a fine travelling coach, the one the servants called his lordship, the grave, dark gentleman who walked the grounds alone and spoke to no one. "That was Julian," Edmund said when she stammered it out. "His cousin. His uncle's son." The account the family gave that the true heir had drowned abroad at 21, and the title had passed sideways to the uncle's branch, was a lie sealed behind boarded windows and reversed portraits, kept alive by a man who visited this gallery once a week, to prove to himself that his nephew had not yet starved. There was a fine art, Charlotte was learning, to being erased. It was not enough to lock a man away. One had to teach the whole world a different story, and let the world's own forgetfulness do the rest. She left him that morning because she had to, because Mrs. Pell would come looking, but she left him a heel of bread from her apron pocket and a promise she was not sure she could keep, which was that she would return. She locked the gallery behind her. She hung the great key back on its nail. And she went down to the servants' hall and ate her dinner, and said nothing at all. And no one looked at her twice, because no one ever did, and she understood for the first time that her invisibility was the only thing in the world that might save the man in the gallery. She returned the next night, and the next, she stole up the servants' stair after the house was dark, the key cold in her fist, and she brought him what she could carry: cold meat, wrapped in a cloth. An apple. Once, recklessly, a small measure of wine in a medicine bottle. She learned the shape of his confinement in pieces. He had been kept there since he was 21 on the night his father, the old earl, died, when his uncle had convinced a grieving, frightened boy that there were men on the road who meant him harm and that he must hide until they passed. She learned it the way one learns a difficult psalm, a line at a time, never the whole of it at once. On the second night, he told her about the books. His uncle had brought them faithfully, crate by crate, over the years, histories and sermons and the Latin poets, and Edmund had read every one of them a dozen times until he could recite whole pages to the boarded window, and he confessed to her that there had been a season, somewhere, in the middle years, when the men in the books had grown more real to him than the memory of his own face, which he no longer trusted, having no glass to check it against. She brought him on the third night a small square of looking-glass she had found in a disused dressing-case, and he held it for a long time and did not speak, and when he gave it back, his hand was not steady, and she did not ask him what he had seen. On the fifth night, he told her about the sounds. He had learned the whole household by its footsteps. He said the heavy tread of Rook, the quick, nervous step of the between maid, the particular pause his uncle made outside the door, before the key went in. A pause Edmund had come to dread more than the turning itself. He knew her step now, he told her, out of all of them. He had known it on the first morning before he had seen her face. It was the only step in 11 years that had ever come to the gallery. Meaning him no harm, the men never came. The door never reopened as anything but a lock. She made him say the sentence aloud once, that the men had never come, because she thought he had never let himself say it, and he did say it. Slowly, the words strange in his mouth, and afterward he sat very still, as though a wall had been taken out of a room, and he did not yet know how to stand in the larger space. His uncle brought him food and books and, for years, a kind of terrible companionship, sitting with him and explaining, always so reasonably, why the world was safer if Edmund remained dead. And Edmund, who had been raised to trust his uncle absolutely, had believed for a long time that this was love. It was the cruelest part of the whole design. The prison had been built out of a boy's affection for the man who buried him. You will want to know why he did not simply refuse to eat, Charlotte thought, or beat his fists against the boarded window, or scream until the whole valley heard. She had wondered it herself. She had come to see, though, that despair is not a single act, but a slow erosion, and that a man told for 11 years that no one is coming will eventually stop listening for footsteps. What she brought him, more than bread, was footsteps. What she brought him was the sound of someone coming. He was not, at first, easy company. He watched her with a wariness that felt, at times, like coldness, and he said little, and when she asked him questions, he turned them aside. She thought perhaps he did not trust her. Later she understood he was afraid of something far worse than betrayal. He was afraid of wanting her to return, because wanting had cost him everything once already. On the 4th night, she found him standing at the boarded window, with his hand flat against the wood, and when she set down the candle he did not turn. "Do not come again," he said. His voice was level. "If they find you here, they will not simply dismiss you. Do you understand what my uncle is capable of? He has spent 11 years teaching a house to unsee a living man. You are one maid. You would be easy." She should have been frightened. She was frightened. Even so, she heard the thing beneath the warning, the way one hears a second instrument under the first, and what she heard was not dismissal but protection, clumsy and desperate, and entirely for her. She crossed the gallery and stood beside him at the window, and said that she had spent 11 years being unseen herself, and that she had found it made her rather difficult to catch. He turned then, and looked at her, really looked. And for the first time since she had opened that door, she saw something in his exhausted face that was not caution. It frightened her more than the warning had. Edmund, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the Earl before it, and the sound of it seemed to undo something in him. "Eat," she said, and held out the bread, and he took it, and their fingers touched in the cold, and neither of them moved for the length of a held breath. She was aware, in that suspended moment, of a great many small things at once. She was aware of the cold coming off the boarded window, and the warmth coming off him, of the rough edge of his sleeve, and the careful stillness of his hand, of her own pulse gone loud and traitorous in her throat, where the collar of her plain gown could not hide it. He must have seen it, the beat of it at her neck, because his eyes went there and then came back to her face. And he drew his hand away first deliberately, the way a man steps back from an edge he has decided not to fall over yet. "Not yet," his stillness said, though neither of them had spoken of any edge at all. She understood that he was protecting her again from himself this time, and she understood that she did not entirely wish to be protected, and both understandings frightened her equally, and she gathered up her candle and went before either of them could name the thing that had begun to stand in the room with them. The house went on above and around this secret, as though nothing in it had changed. Julian, the false earl, walked the grounds each morning in his fine dark coat, grave and solitary, and the household called him his lordship, and dropped their eyes as he passed. Charlotte watched him now with different attention. She could not decide whether he knew. He had the look of a man carrying a weight. But so did every man who had inherited a great house and a colder duty, and she could not tell his guilt from his grief. Once she came upon him in the library standing before a portrait of the old earl that had not been turned to the wall, and his face, when he thought himself alone, was not the face of a man enjoying a stolen inheritance. It was the face of a man who suspected the floor beneath him was not solid. He did not hear her at the door. He stood with his hands clasped behind him, and his head tilted a little back to meet the painted eyes, and he said something under his breath that she could not hear but could read in the shape of his mouth, and it was a name, and the name was not his own. She withdrew before he could turn. She thought about it for a long while afterward, lying awake in the maid's garret with the key, cold against her chest where she had taken to keeping it. A man who had wanted the title would not stand alone before his uncle's brother, and speak a dead cousin's name to an empty room. She had learned to read faces the way her father had taught her to read Latin, for the grammar beneath the surface, and Julian's face was a sentence with grief for its subject and guilt for its verb, and she filed the reading away without yet knowing what she would do with it. The one who frightened her was not Julian, but the steward, Mr. Rook, who kept the keys and the accounts and the household's small cruelties, and who had begun, she thought, to watch her. He was a lean, grey man, wholly devoted to the uncle, and he had noticed, perhaps, that the North Wing maid was thinner than she had been, that she gave away her dinner, that she was tired in the mornings, in the particular way of someone who did not sleep at night. He said nothing. He only watched the way a cat watches a gap in a wall, patient and certain that something would eventually move through it. He began to find small reasons to be in the North Passage in the evenings. A lamp to trim, a lock to try, a tallow count that could as easily have waited for morning. He asked her once in the servants' hall with the whole table listening, whether she found the North Wing lonely of a night, and the way he said it, soft and pleasant, was worse than any accusation, because an accusation could be denied and a pleasantry could not. She said only that she slept sound and rose early, which was the truth turned inside out, and she felt his grey eyes on the back of her neck all the way out of the room. That night she took the longer stair, and the night after she did not go up at all. And she lay in the dark and hated the caution that kept her from the one door that mattered. And she thought of Edmund on the far side of it counting footsteps that did not come. And she wept silently into the coarse ticking so that no one above or below would hear. She was careful. She was so careful. Care, Charlotte was learning, is not the same as safety, and the more she had to lose, the more there was to be taken. The uncle returned from Bath 3 weeks after Charlotte had opened the gallery, and the whole household stiffened at his coming. He was a large, genial, white-haired gentleman named Lord Silas Vane. No relation to Charlotte despite the shared name, which had made him laugh once, kindly, when she was first hired, and remark that perhaps they were cousins 10 times removed and would she like a position above stairs. Pell had gone rigid with disapproval, and the offer had come to nothing. Charlotte had thought him warm. Then, she knew better now. She had learned that the most complete cruelty wears the face of kindness. Because kindness is what lowers the guard, and Lord Silas had lowered the guard of an entire county for 11 years, while his true nephew wasted behind boards. On his second evening home he called the household together in the great hall to welcome him, servants and all, and he made a little speech about family and continuity and the sacred trust of the Thornley name, and he looked, as he spoke, directly at Charlotte, and smiled. It was the smile that told her Rook had spoken. It was the smile of a man who knew exactly where his key had been walking at night, and who was not yet afraid. She kept her face still. She had 11 years of practice at keeping her face still. Her hands, folded before her apron, had gone cold as the gallery floor, and she understood that the slow, patient game was over, and the fast, cruel one had begun. That night the key was not on its nail. Charlotte stood in the dark passage outside the steward's room, and looked at the empty hook, and felt the whole fragile architecture of her night's collapse. Rook had taken the key, which meant Rook knew, which meant Edmund behind his boarded window was waiting for footsteps that could not come, and would go on waiting, and would decide at last that she too had been a thing he dreamed. She could not bear it. She found, standing in that cold passage, that she could not bear it more than she feared anything Lord Silas might do to her, and that discovery reorganized her entirely. A woman with nothing to lose is careful. A woman who has finally found something she cannot lose becomes something else. She went to Julian. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, and she did it at 2 a.m, climbing to the door of the false earl's chamber and knocking, a housemaid waking the master of the house, an offense that could see her turned out onto the road by dawn. He opened the door in his shirt sleeves with a candle in his hand and stared at her, and she said, before her courage could fail, that there was a man locked in the sealed gallery who called himself Edmund, and named himself the true Earl, and that she believed him, and that his uncle had taken the key, and she was afraid of what came next. She watched the words land. She watched Julian's face, and she understood in an instant everything she had not been able to read before. He did not look astonished. He looked as a man looks when the thing he has feared in the dark for years is finally spoken aloud by another voice and is therefore real and can no longer be endured in silence. He set down the candle. His hand was not steady. "I was told he drowned," Julian said. "I was 20. My father wept at the memorial. I have worn a dead man's title for 11 years, and I have never once slept a whole night through, because some part of me counted the wrong number of graves." He sat down slowly on the edge of his own bed, the candle throwing his shadow up the wall, and he told her the rest of it in a low, unbroken voice, as though he had been waiting years for a single person to whom he could say it. He had been abroad when the drowning was reported, sent conveniently to the continent by his father the summer Edmund vanished, and he had come home to black crape and a sealed memorial and a title pressed into his hands, like a gift he had never asked to receive. He had questioned it once, early, and his father had looked at him with such cold finality that he had never questioned it again, and the not questioning had become a habit, and the habit had become 11 years, and the 11 years had become a kind of sleep from which he had never quite woken. Charlotte listened, and she thought of Edmund saying that the prison had been built out of a boy's affection, and she saw that Lord Silas had built 2 prisons out of 2 boys. Love for him and kept both men inside their separate walls with the same patient, genial, monstrous hand. They did not go to the gallery that night because the key was gone and the household was watched, and a false step now would cost Edmund his life. Instead, they did something harder and slower and far more frightening. They waited and they planned. And Charlotte carried messages between a false earl who wanted only to be rid of a title he had never wanted, and a true earl who did not yet know his cousin was an ally rather than a jailer. She told Edmund, through the gap beneath the gallery door, where once she had passed bread, that Julian had not known, that Julian wept for him, that Julian was even now writing in secret to the old earl's solicitor in London and to 2 magistrates who had known Edmund as a boy and could swear to his face. She heard him go still on the other side of the door. She heard him say her name once, low, as though it were a thing he was afraid to spend. She had begun in those waiting days to measure her hours by the gap beneath that door. She would kneel to it in the dark and lay her cheek against the cold boards, and they would talk in the barest thread of whisper. She found that a whispered voice with no face to read taught her more of a man than a year of daylight might. He told her the things he wanted, small, impossible things that broke her heart with their smallness, to stand in a rain again, to eat a meal at a table with another person across it, to see the valley go green in the spring from a window with no boards on it. And once when she asked him what he wanted most, there was a silence, and then he said, low, that he wanted to know the color of her eyes in daylight, because he had only ever seen them by candle, and that he had lain awake deciding they were gray, and then deciding they were not, and being unable to bear that he could not simply look. It was not a grand declaration. It was the plainest sentence a man had ever given her, and it undid her more completely than any grand one could have, because she understood that he was not naming duty or gratitude or the debt of the rescued to the rescuer. He was naming want, hers and his together, through an inch of oak, in the dark. Charlotte, he said, if this fails, they will hang for it, or worse. And you will be blamed, and I will have killed the one person who ever came. Tell me why you are doing this. She pressed her hand flat to the cold wood where she imagined his was, and she told him the truth, which she had not admitted even to herself until that moment. Because I opened a door I was told to leave shut, she said, and I found a person where the whole world swore there was nothing, and I have spent my life being that person. The nothing the world swears is not there. I will not lock the door again. I would rather hang. There was a long silence on the other side. Then his voice changed. When you open this door for the last time, he said, I mean to walk out of it and never let anyone put me behind a wall. Again, and I mean to ask you something. and I am telling you now so that you have time to be certain of your answer." She did not ask him what. She did not need to. Her heart had already answered loud enough that she was half afraid he could hear it through the door. Lord Silas moved first, because men like Lord Silas always believe they can move fastest. He announced at breakfast in front of the whole gathered family and the visiting neighbors he had shrewdly assembled that he intended to formally settle the Thornley succession that very week, to have Julian confirmed as Earl beyond any future question, and to close the north wing permanently, the old gallery to be demolished. He said genially, "Its dangerous old floors a hazard, the work to begin at once." Charlotte, serving at the sideboard, understood the sentence for what it was. He meant to bury Edmund inside the demolition. He meant to end the 11-year game in a single afternoon of falling plaster. An accident. A tragedy. The old wing come down at last. He was smiling as he said it. He looked at Julian for agreement, certain of it, because Julian had agreed to everything for 11 years. The neighbors murmured their approval, for it was a sensible thing, a hazard removed, an old grief laid finally to rest, and one white-haired lady said, "What a comfort it must be to see the family settled at last." Charlotte's hands did not shake as she set down the coffee pot. Though everything in her had gone to ice, she had known the demolition would come. She had not known it would come dressed so pleasantly, announced over eggs and toast to smiling faces, an execution with the manners of a garden party. She looked at Lord Silas buttering his bread, and understood at last the full shape of the man, that he felt nothing, that he had never felt anything, that the kindness had always been only a tool laid down when it had done its work. And she looked at Julian, and she prayed, without moving her lips, the way she had prayed over her father's testament in the dark. Julian set down his cup. The room waited for the dutiful nephew to nod. He did not nod. He rose instead at his own breakfast table before the neighbors and the family and the servants and his father. And he was pale, but his voice did not shake. And he said the thing that ended everything in fewer words than anyone expected. "My cousin Edmund is alive in that gallery." The silence that followed was the silence of a room in which the floor has genuinely given way. Lord Silas's genial face did not so much fall as dissolve, feature by feature, the kindness sliding off it like water off glass to show the cold arithmetic beneath. He began to speak, to laugh, to call it a cruel jest, a fever of grief. The boy was not well. Julian was already turning to the doorway where the two magistrates he had summoned under a false pretext now stood, having heard every word, and behind them Mr. Rook, who had understood in one glance that the ship was going down, and that a steward who wished to survive must be the first to name the true captain, and who now produced from his own coat, with the smooth treachery of the perfectly practical, the very key he had taken from its nail. They went up the stairs together, the whole terrible procession of them. And Charlotte went with them, because no one thought to stop her, and it was her hand in the end that the magistrate placed the key into, because Julian said quietly that she had found him, and she should be the one to open the door. She fitted the iron into the lock. She thought of the first morning, the bone-crack sound, the reversed faces, the sweet and terrible dark. She turned the key, and Edmund walked out of the sealed gallery into the gray October light on his own 2 feet, thin and blinking and upright, a dead man made flesh in front of the very people who had been taught to bury him, and he did not look at his uncle, and he did not look at the magistrates. He looked at Charlotte. Lord Silas was not dragged out or struck down. That is not how such things end, whatever the stories say. He was simply, in the space of an hour, unmade. The magistrates took his statement, and then took his person into their keeping, to answer at the assizes for what the law had a great many long words for, and the household had only one, which was the truth. He went quietly at the last, an old man suddenly looking every year of his age, and the only thing he said, passing Charlotte in the corridor, was that he had never thought the North Wing maid would look. It was the same thing almost that Rook's watching had assumed, and that Mrs. Pell had feared aloud on Charlotte's first week. A girl who reads too well, a girl who looks. The whole house had been built on the certainty that no one would and one woman had, and the certainty had come down like a boarded window pried open to the light, Edmund was ill for a long while after. 11 years does not leave a body quickly, and there were nights he woke unable to bear a closed door, and Charlotte learned to leave every door in the house standing open so that the air moved through Thornley freely for the first time in a decade, and the sealed rooms became simply rooms again. The first days were the hardest. He could not manage the open sky at all in the beginning, and would stand at the threshold of the terrace with his hand gripping the frame and his breath coming short. And Charlotte would stand beside him and not touch him and not hurry him, and name small ordinary things aloud until the world grew bearable again, the color of the grass, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of a cart on the lane. Learning the daylight was a labor. He had to be taught his own house, room by room, the great staircase, the morning room, the library where his father's books still stood, and each remembered thing seemed to cost him something, even as it gave something back. He ate too little, and slept in snatches, and startled at the sound of a key in any lock anywhere in the house. And Charlotte took every key she could find and put them away in a drawer she left open, so that no lock in Thornley could turn without both of them knowing. Slowly across the wet end of the autumn and into the first frosts, the man came back into the body. He gained a little flesh. He laughed once at something Julian said, a rusty, startled sound that surprised them all, and Charlotte saw Julian's face when it happened and understood that the two cousins were being returned to each other as surely as Edmund was being returned to the light. Julian, who had never wanted the title and had only ever wanted his cousin returned, saw the succession restored to Edmund with something close to joy, and stayed on as steward of the estate in Rook's place, and the two cousins learned slowly to sit in a room together without the ghost of a lie between them. The reversed portraits were turned to face outward once more. The Thornley family looked out again upon its own gallery, and the boards came down from the tall window, and the north light returned. Charlotte was there when the last board was pried loose. She had asked to be, and no one had thought to refuse, the woman who had opened the door, and she stood beside Edmund in the emptied gallery, while a workman drew the final nail and the gray autumn light came flooding in across the boards where once her single candle had thrown its shadow. Edmund did not speak. Guy. He turned his face up to the window and closed his eyes, and the light lay across his thin, recovered face, and Charlotte watched him receive it, and she thought that she had never in her life seen anything she wished so much to keep. He reached, without looking, and found her hand, and this time there was no cold oak between them, and no edge to step back from, and he laced his fingers through hers in the plain daylight, and they stood together in the room that had been a grave, and was now only a gallery, only a long, bright room in a house where the doors stood open. There is a question you may still be holding, the one Edmund had told her to be certain of. He asked it in the spring, on the first truly warm morning, in the gallery that was no longer a prison. Standing beneath the restored portrait of his father, with the window open behind him, and the valley green below, he asked her to marry him, an earl to a housemaid, the whole weight of the Thornley name behind so impossible a thing. And he asked it plainly, without a single grand word, because he had spent 11 years learning that the grand words were the ones that lied. "Charlotte," he said, "you opened the door. Stay on the far side of it with me." She thought of her father's sold books, and her 15 years of keeping her eyes down and the heel of bread passed in the dark, and she said yes, and he took her hand in the north light, and neither of them this time let go when the breath had passed. They were married quietly before the summer, in the small stone church in the valley, with Julian standing witness and Mrs. Pell weeping in a back pew for reasons she could not have explained and did not try to. Charlotte wore a gown of soft green that Edmund had chosen, the first new thing she had owned in a decade, and she carried a few late snowdrops picked from the churchyard grass, and she thought, walking up the short aisle, of her father, the curate, who had stood at just such an altar, and would have had no words at all for the sight of his grey daughter married under the Thornley name. The valley people came, the ones who had been taught for 11 years that the true earl was drowned and had lived to see him restored, and they were quiet, and glad, in the country way, and afterward there was bread and cider in the churchyard, and a fiddle. And Edmund stood in the open air with the sun on his face, and did not once reach for a wall. Charlotte kept all her life the great iron key of the long gallery. She did not hang it back on any nail. She kept it on the mantel of the room she now shared, where the fire burned in the evenings and the doors of Thornley Court stood open to the dark. And when their first child was old enough to ask what the old key opened, Edmund told him, in a steady voice, that it had once opened the most important door in the world, and that a woman no one had thought to notice had been the one to turn it. The key caught the firelight. Outside, the first snow of the year came down soft over the valley, over the church, over the tall, unboarded window, where the north light had returned for good. If Charlotte and Edmund's story stayed with you, stay a moment and leave a word about the part that did, and I will carry on telling you the ones the world tried to seal away.